Along the coastal farms of McIntosh County, Georgia, records from the 1830s hold a strange note that shows up in 17 different books. These were measurements of a woman's body size that went beyond anything people expected in those times. The numbers listed a 48-inch chest, arms measuring 19 inches around, and shoulders spanning 23 inches. These belonged to someone the plantation owners called their best investment. What made these sizes amazing wasn't just how big they were, but what they stood for. It was a planned experiment in breeding people that went on for 3 generations and made a woman whose strength became both her cage and her weapon. The wet air of the coast still sticks to the old papers that prove she lived, and the smell of old ink mixes with something darker, the planned meanness of men who treated human beings like farm animals to be made better. Official records stop suddenly in 1847, but what they show before that silence is a story that questions everything we know about staying alive, revenge, and how far people will go to take back their humanity. See historians who have studied the Georgia coast speak in quiet voices about the Hargrove papers, and several researchers have refused to keep looking after reading the full truth of what was done. The measurements themselves tell only a small part of the tale. The real horror is in the planned method, the long-term planning, and the cold exactness with which humans were turned into numbers in breeding books. Before we go on with the story of the woman known only as number 47 in the farm records, if you are interested in hidden histories that show the darkest parts of America's past, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us which state you are listening from. Stories like this need to be remembered. The old documents from McIntosh County don't just hold numbers. They hold the plan of a fixation that ate up 3 generations of the Hargrove family and left a mark on Georgia history that officials tried very hard to wipe away. The Hargrove plantation sat between the Altamaha River and the Atlantic coast, where the air hung heavy with salt and the nonstop noise of bugs made a humming sound that never ended. By 1810, Alexander Hargrove had made his money on rice farming, turning wet marshlands into working fields through a cruel system that needed constant work in knee-deep water under the hot Georgia sun. But Alexander had goals that went beyond just money. He had spent 18 months in Jamaica during 1807 and 1808, supposedly studying sugar making. But his real lesson came from watching what plantation owners there called selective improvement, the habit of breeding enslaved people for certain body traits, treating human having babies as a form of farm science. Alexander came back to Georgia with 3 leather-bound books filled with notes, sizes, and ideas for human breeding. He wrote down successful matches in Jamaica, noted which body parts seemed to be passed down, and made up his own theories about how to make strength, staying power, and body size better over time. His wife Charlotte found the books scary and refused to talk about them, which suited Alexander just fine. This was work he planned to do without anyone stopping him, without questions of right and wrong, and without the feelings that he believed made other owners weak. The plantation itself spread across 2,000 acres, with the main house put on a small hill that let the Hargroves look over their fields and the quarters where 300 enslaved people lived in conditions of planned misery. The main house was built in the Georgian style with white columns and wide porches designed to catch breezes from the coast. Inside, The furniture showed Alexander's wealth, with chairs from England, silver from Charleston, and crystal from France. The difference between the fancy main house and the rough wooden shacks of the living quarters was done on purpose, a physical sign of the ranking Alexander believed was natural and needed. Alexander's way of managing the farm was orderly. He kept strict records of every enslaved person, their skills, their health, their family ties, and how much work they could do. But he also kept a separate set of records locked in his office that tracked what he called his improvement program. These records listed body sizes, tracked family lines, and picked out people who had traits he thought were worth money. He was very interested in height, muscle growth, bone shape, and what he called constitutional vigor, the ability to handle hard conditions without getting sick. By 1815, Alexander had picked several families within his enslaved group that he thought were good for his breeding tests. He began controlling who could be partners, splitting up couples who didn't meet his rules, and forcing marriages between people he believed would make children with the looks he wanted. The meanness of this system was made worse by how planned it was. Alexander didn't act from anger or sudden feeling, but from cold scientific thinking that made every forced split and arranged marriage part of a bigger plan. The living quarters ran under their own social rules that Alexander never fully understood. People kept African ways brought across the ocean, practiced spiritual beliefs that mixed Christianity with older religions, and made tight communities that gave emotional help in a world designed to break their spirits. They sang work songs that held hidden messages, told stories that kept history and culture alive, and made smart systems for sharing goods and protecting the weak. Among the enslaved group were natural leaders who earned respect through wisdom, bravery, or spiritual power. One such person was a woman named Zena, old by the standards of the time at 53, who worked as a baby doctor and healer. Zena had been born in West Africa and survived the Middle Passage crossing as a child. She remembered freedom, and she kept that memory alive by teaching younger groups about their past, about self, worth, and about the fact that their current life was not natural or sure to stay, but put on them by force. Zena watched Alexander's breeding program with growing fear. She had delivered babies for 20 years, and she had seen families torn apart when children didn't grow according to Alexander's hopes. She understood what he was trying to do: create a line of enslaved people who would be worth more, work harder, and therefore be more totally trapped in chains. Her fight against this program was both practical and spiritual. She believed that controlling human babies in this way went against natural law and invited bad results that Alexander couldn't see coming. But Zena had no power to stop Alexander Hargrove. She could only write down or remember what she saw, passing news to people she trusted, making a spoken history that would save the truth, even if official papers were destroyed. She taught younger people to remember names, dates, and details, turning memory into a way of fighting back against a system that wanted to erase each person's humanity. Alexander's son, Marcus Hargrove, was born in 1802 and raised in a place where his father's breeding program was simply part of running the farm. Marcus never asked if it was wrong to treat people as animals. It was the only system he knew, and his father showed it as smart farm science rather than planned abuse. By the time Marcus was 15, He was going with his father to inspect the quarters, learning to look at people with the same cold distance Alexander used, seeing human beings as investments to be made better. Marcus got both the plantation and the fixation in 1825, when Alexander died from a fever that moved through the coast. Marcus was 23, newly married to a Savannah merchant's daughter named Elizabeth, and set on proving himself good enough for his inheritance. He had spent his teen years studying his father's books, and he believed he could do better than Alexander's methods by using even more careful watching and note-taking. Marcus grew the breeding program a lot. Where Alexander had focused on a few families, Marcus cast a wider net, checking the whole enslaved group and picking many family lines for specific breeding. He hired a boss specifically to help with this work, a German immigrant named Klaus Reinhardt, who had worked on a horse breeding farm in Pennsylvania and brought those same rules to breeding humans without any obvious guilt. Reinhardt kept a leather-bound book where he wrote sizes, workability, and body growth with careful attention to detail. His handwriting was beautiful, almost like art, a sharp difference to the horror of what he was writing down. He measured children starting at age 3, tracking their growth, noting which ones showed early signs of strength or size. He checked adults for breeding use, matching people based on body looks rather than their own choices or feelings. His book entries read like cow records: male 23, height 6'2", chest 44, good for pairing with female 17 or female 19. Produced male child measuring 22 at birth. Above average, keep watching. Life in the quarters happened under constant watching. People lived in wooden shacks that measured about 12 by 14 feet and held whole families. The buildings leaked during the frequent coastal rains and baked during summer months when heat often went over 95 degrees with wet air that made breathing feel like work. They slept on rough wooden pallets covered with corn husk mattresses, wore clothes made from rough fabric that rubbed their skin raw, and got food portions meant to give just enough energy to keep working without improving total health. The work itself was cruel. Rice farming needed non-stop labor in standing water, which made perfect spots for mosquitoes that spread sickness. Workers spent hours bent over in flooded fields, their hands cut by sharp rice plants, their bodies open to the sun that caused heat sickness. During harvest time, the work lasted from first light until darkness made it impossible to go on, and even then, there were processing jobs that went into the night. But for some families, there was an extra weight. They were part of the Hargrove breeding program, their family lives controlled as carefully as their work. Women were watched for pregnancy, checked by Reinhardt to ensure healthy growth, and separated from husbands if babies didn't come within expected times. Children born into the program were checked constantly, their bodies measured and written down, their every growth step recorded in Reinhardt's books. The coastal area had grown its own distinct culture among the enslaved people. Many had Gullah, Chi-Chi roots, keeping speech patterns that mixed African languages with English, making a way of speaking that their bosses struggled to understand. They cooked traditional foods like okra, rice dishes, and fish from coastal waters, keeping cooking ways that tied them to African roots. They made art through basket weaving using sweetgrass and palm leaves to make complex patterns that carried hidden meanings. They kept spiritual habits that used African beliefs, using music, dance, and ceremony to save their cultural identity. Among this group was a family that would become central to Marcus Hargrove's biggest experiment. The woman known in farm records as Dinina stood nearly 6 feet tall, unusual for any woman of that time, but very notable in a group where bad food usually stopped growth. She had been born on the farm in 1800, making her 25 when Marcus got the property. Dinina worked in the rice fields, and bosses noted her ability for heavy labor, her toughness against common sicknesses, and her unusual body strength. Her partner, listed only as Big Tom in farm records, measured 6 feet 4 inches and had amazing strength that made him valuable for jobs needing raw power. Tom had been bought from a Virginia farm in 1823, taken from his family as part of paying a debt. He had arrived at the Hargrove plantation angry and sad, but he had found in Dinina someone who understood loss, and together they had built a relationship that gave an emotional anchor in a world designed to stop exactly that kind of human bond. Marcus Hargrove saw Dinina and Tom and imagined the future of his breeding program. He believed that pairing two people with such huge physical traits would make children who got the best parts of both parents. He approved their marriage, one of the few times enslaved people's own choices matched the management's breeding decisions, and he waited with high hopes for results that would prove his theories right. On a March morning in 1826, as dawn light came through the cracks in the quarters birthing room, Dinina went into labor. The birthing room was a small space barely 10 feet square, with a dirt floor covered by straw and walls that had been painted white years ago, but now showed stains from many births before. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with the smell of sweat and the metal smell of blood. Zena helped with the birth along with 2 younger women who were learning baby doctor skills, and they moved around Dinina with practiced speed, bringing water from the well, getting cloths ready, whispering hope in Gullah, sounding English that carried the beat of African languages. Labor lasted through the morning and into early afternoon. Dinina bore the pain with great bravery, gritting her teeth and breathing through pains while Zena checked progress and offered what comfort she could. The other women in the quarters knew what was happening. News had spread that Dinina was delivering, and many found reasons to walk near the birthing room, offering silent support by being close, even though they weren't allowed inside during the actual birth. The baby arrived just after 2:00 in the afternoon, coming into Zena's experienced hands with a cry that was notably strong. Zena cut the cord with a blade she had cleaned over fire, tied it off with practiced moves, and handed the baby to one of her helpers for cleaning while she helped Dinina, ensuring everything was finished safely and checking for problems that often made childbirth deadly for enslaved women who got no real medical care. The baby was a girl, healthy and unusually large. Even before proper measuring, Zena could see this was no normal baby. The baby's arms and legs were longer than average compared to her body, her frame more solid, her cries stronger and longer. Zena felt a chill of warning as she cleaned and looked at the child. She had seen Marcus Hargrove's interest in Dinina and Tom's union, understood what he was hoping for, and she feared what this baby's special traits might mean for her future. Within 2 hours, Klaus Reinhardt showed up at the birthing room. His arrival was rare. Bosses didn't usually involve themselves in births unless problems came up that threatened property. But Reinhardt had been told by Marcus Hargrove to attend this specific birth personally, to write down everything, to provide an instant check of the child's traits. Reinhardt entered the small space with his book and measuring tools, making an air of cold watching that broke the closeness of the moment. He looked at the baby with the careful attention of someone inspecting valuable goods, measuring her length with a cloth tape, noting the size of her head, chest, arms, and legs. He wrote down her weight using a scale normally used for measuring tobacco leaves. The baby, only hours old, became a subject of study rather than a celebration of new life. Dinina watched this checkup with tired sadness. She had known this moment would come, had understood throughout her pregnancy that her child would be of special interest to the Hargroves. But seeing the reality of Reinhardt's cold checkup made the situation undeniably clear. Her daughter was not truly hers, but property of the farm, an investment to be watched and grown according to Marcus Hargrove's dream. Reinhardt made his notes with happiness showing on his face. The baby measured 23 inches long, much above the average of 18 to 20 inches for newborns. Her weight was 8 pounds 3 ounces, healthy but not rare. But her length and the balanced growth of her limbs suggested a chance for great height and muscle growth. Reinhardt wrote these thoughts in his journal, then added a note that this baby represented promising first results for the breeding program. Marcus Hargrove appeared before sunset, leaving the main house to visit the quarters personally, another rare action that showed the importance he placed on this birth. He stood in the birthing room's doorway, too fancy to enter the space, but close enough to watch, while Reinhardt reported what he found. Marcus listened with the intense focus he brought to all matters related to his breeding program, asking detailed questions about sizes, comparing them to data from his father's books, guessing potential adult growth based on birth traits. Then Marcus gave orders that would define the child's whole life. She was to get extra food starting right away. Her mother would be given more food during nursing to make sure milk was good. The child's body growth was to be checked weekly for the first year, then monthly after that. She would be trained specifically for jobs that would build muscle once she was old enough for work. Most importantly, Marcus gave the baby a code, number 47, in the plantation's breeding records. The number referred to her spot in a numbered list of children born into the breeding program, a cold office name that turned a human being into data in a book. Dinina wanted to name her daughter Sarah after her own grandmother, who had been born in Africa and kept fierce pride until her death. It was a small act of humanity, a claim that this child was a person with a name and past, not merely experimental property. But the name Sarah never showed up in official farm records. To Marcus Hargrove, Klaus Reinhardt, and the bosses of the plantation, the baby was simply 47, a number representing money, hope, and the proof of theories about human breeding. The extra food created instant problems in the quarters. Food was already hard to get, given out in carefully measured amounts designed to keep work going without making people healthy or strong. Now Dinina and her baby received portions of salt pork, cornmeal, and beans that were more than standard amounts taken from the same limited supply meant to feed 300 people. Some disliked this special treatment, seeing it as favoritism that came at their cost. Others understood it was a poisoned gift. The extra food came with strings attached, with expectations and control that would make the child's life a different form of hell than the hunger that most enslaved people lived with. Zina tried to help Dinina handle this situation. She advised being quiet, suggested sharing some of the extra food with others to build friendship rather than anger. She warned that the child would face unique tests as she grew, would need the group's protection and unity, and pushing people away through perceived perks, even forced perks put on by owners, would make staying alive harder. Dinina listened to this advice and tried to follow it. She shared what she could, kept friendships with other women in the quarters, and tried to raise her daughter with some feeling of normal childhood, despite the constant watching and measuring that marked every stage of the girl's growth. As baby 47, whom Dinina called Sarah in private moments, grew through her first year, the differences became more and more clear. By 3 months, she was clearly bigger than other babies her age. By 6 months, she was pulling herself up and showing unusually strong grip. By her first birthday, she was walking steadily and showing balance that typically developed later. Reinhardt wrote down everything. His journal entries during this time read like animal breeding records. Subject 47 at 6 months shows 15% greater muscle in arms compared to average. Superior grip noted during check. Mother continues healthy, milk output good. Suggest keeping extra food through weaning time. Or subject 47 at 10 months shows advanced moving skills. Walking without help as of October 3rd, 1,826. Father's height genes apparently showing, guessing adult height 6'0" to 6'3". Muscle points suggest room for huge strength growth. Marcus Hargrove read these reports with deep happiness. His breeding program was making exactly the results he had hoped for, proving years of theory and planning. He began thinking about the next generation, about which male children in the program would be good matches for subject 47 when she reached breeding age. He made notes in his own journals, guessing timelines, expecting outcomes, treating the far future of a 1-year-old baby as already set and mapped. The quarters watched Sarah's growth with mixed feelings. Some saw her as proof that fighting back was useless. The Hargroves could literally breed people for their goals, controlling not just work, but biology itself. Others saw her as a possible source of pride, proof that enslaved people could be strong and special even in chains. A few, including Xena, feared what would happen when Sarah became fully aware of what she was being made into, what she stood for, and what her future held. By age 2, Sarah was speaking in full sentences, showing smarts that matched her body growth. She absorbed the language of the quarters, learning both standard English and the Gullah dialect that was still widely spoken. She learned songs that carried secret codes, heard stories about ancestors and Africa, and absorbed the culture of resistance that lived in enslaved groups, even under constant watching. But she also became aware of being different. Other children her age were smaller, less strong, less constantly watched. Sarah noticed Reinhardt measuring her, noting how other adults watched her with a mix of pride and worry. She began to understand in the feeling way children grasp complex situations without fully knowing them, that she was special, but that this specialness was not entirely good. The years between 1,828 and 1,835 marked Sarah's change from a smart toddler into a child whose body growth went past every guess Marcus Hargrove had made. By age 5, she stood nearly 4 feet tall, towering over children her own age and matching the height of children 3 or 4 years older. Her body showed unusual muscle shape that typically didn't appear until teen years. Her arms and legs were longer than average compared to her body, giving her a lanky look that suggested she would eventually reach amazing height. Reinhardt's measurements during this time showed orderly growth that seemed to prove every theory about passed-down traits and selective breeding. At age 5, Sarah's chest measured 30 inches around, her arms measured 9 inches around, and her shoulders spanned 14 inches. These numbers appeared constantly in Reinhardt's journals, along with notes about her physical skills, her balance, her clear health and energy. But the numbers didn't catch the mental reality of Sarah's life. She was aware now, fully awake to being constantly judged, measured, watched. Every week, Reinhardt would call her to a small building near the main house that served as his office. She would stand on a raised box while he measured various parts of her body, wrote data in his journal, sometimes made her lift things or do physical tasks while he noted her skills. These meetings were shaming and scary. Sarah learned to let her mind drift away during them, to let her thoughts go elsewhere while her body stayed present for Reinhardt's cold check. Marcus Hargrove increased her food again as she grew, ensuring she received plates that included meat, beans, vegetables, and cornbread, a diet much better than what most enslaved people got. This created ongoing stress in the quarters. Food remained rare for everyone else, and seeing a child get better treatment while adults went hungry made anger that Sarah could feel even when people tried to hide it. Her mother, Dinina, tried to shield her from some of this anger by continuing to share what they got. But there was only so much she could do. The truth was that Sarah's life had become political within the quarter's social group. She represented the breeding program's win, and people's feelings toward her showed their feelings toward the system itself, whether they had been broken into accepting it, whether they kept hope for fighting back, whether they had found ways to survive mentally by not thinking too deeply about their spot. At age 7, Sarah was put to work. Most enslaved children began light work around this age, jobs fitting their size and strength, but Sarah's jobs were different, specifically designed to build her body skills. She carried loads of rice stalks from fields to work areas, building her back and leg muscles. She dragged heavy baskets, building upper body strength. She spent hours at tasks that would have been given to teenage boys, and she did them well despite her young age. Marcus Hargrove watched this progress with happiness that was almost an obsession. He had begun inviting other plantation owners to visit, showing them his records, explaining his breeding program, showing off Sarah as proof that choosing parents could produce better workers. These visits were torture for Sarah. She was made to stand still while men talked about her body as if she were a cow, compared her sizes against their own enslaved groups, argued about the money needed for such programs. Some visitors were impressed, seeing potential money in Marcus' approach. Others were doubtful, questioning whether the cost required for such programs would yield enough profit. A few expressed moral unease, though they typically did so quietly and without seriously challenging the main idea that enslaved people could be bred like animals. Sarah absorbed all of this. She listened to talks not meant for her ears, learned to read men's faces and tones, developed an understanding of how she was seen and what her life meant within the larger system of slavery. This knowledge was both helpful and crushing. Helpful because it gave her insight into her captor's thinking. crushing because it confirmed that she was not seen as fully human by the people who controlled every part of her life. During this time, Xena continued serving as a source of wisdom and different view. She was old now, moving more slowly, but still respected throughout the quarters for her knowledge and goodness. Xena spent time with Sarah when she could, teaching her about African roots, about family who had been free, about the fact that slavery was not natural or sure, but a state put on by force and kept through violence. These talks gave Sarah a way to understand her situation that differed wildly from Marcus Hargrove's story. Where Marcus saw successful breeding and improved property, Xena taught Sarah to see planned abuse and the breaking of natural law. Where Marcus celebrated Sarah's strength as proof of his theories, Xena helped Sarah understand that her strength was her own, a deep part of who she was rather than something created by the Hargroves program. But Xena also taught Sarah to be patient, to survive, to wait for chances rather than acting from anger in ways that would get her killed. The coastal regions had seen many slave risings over the years. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, Denmark Vesey's planned rising in Charleston in 1822, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831, all had been violently stopped with people killed and communities put under more watching and cruelty. Xena knew that fighting back was needed but had to be smart, timed for moments when success was possible rather than big acts that resulted in death without getting freedom. By age 10, Sarah had taken this lesson to heart. Survive first, fight smartly, wait for the right moment. She continued doing her assigned work, submitted to Reinhardt's measurements without visible fight, and kept a mask of obedience that hid growing awareness and carefully controlled rage. Her body growth continued to go past guesses. At 10, she stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with sizes that approached those of adult women. Her arms measured 14 inches around, her chest 38 inches, her shoulders 20 inches across. She could lift loads that adult men struggled with, and Marcus Hargrove wrote down every win with pride that completely ignored Sarah's humanity. He had begun showing her off more often now, hosting gatherings where plantation owners from across Georgia and nearby states came specifically to watch Sarah and hear about the breeding program. These gatherings followed a set pattern. Marcus would talk about his methods and theories. Reinhardt would present written sizes and growth timelines, and then Sarah would be brought out to show her strength. She would be made to lift heavy objects, 60-pound sacks of rice, barrels filled with water, even an iron block that weighed close to 200 pounds. She would be made to stand still while men walked around her, looking at her muscles, discussing her body as if she weren't there. Sometimes they would ask her questions. How old was she? Did she get tired? Could she work full days without rest? And she learned to answer in ways that satisfied them without showing her true thoughts. The shame of these shows was deep and adding up. Each one reinforced Sarah's understanding that she was not a person to these men, but an example, a proof of concept, a thing to be valued and potentially copied. The shame burned inside her, creating pressure that built with each passing year, but had no way out, nowhere to be released without terrible results. During private moments with her mother, Sarah sometimes let this pressure show. She would cry from frustration and rage, would question why this was happening to her, would express desperate wishes for escape or revenge. Denina held her during these moments, provided what comfort she could, but she also reinforced Xena's lessons about patience and staying alive. Dinina knew that Sarah's strength made her valuable, and valuable property was watched too closely to escape easily. Any attempt at running would fail, and the punishment would be hard. So Sarah learned to hide her feelings, to present a blank face to the world, while fury built inside her like steam in a sealed pot. She learned to disconnect during the shows, letting her mind drift to other places while her body remained present for the crowd's check. She learned to survive mentally in a situation designed to break her spirit without hurting the body strength that Marcus Hargrove prized. By age 12, Sarah's measurements went past those of most adult women and many men. She stood 5 feet 11 inches tall with a chest measuring 42 inches, arms measuring 17 inches around, and shoulders spanning 22 inches. Her body strength was amazing. She could lift over 300 pounds, could work continuously for hours without apparent tiredness, and showed no signs of the health problems that hurt many enslaved people who suffered from poor food and constant sickness. Marcus Hargrove hired a traveling artist to paint Sarah's picture. The artist, a man named Benjamin Crawford from Charleston, spent 3 days on the plantation in September 1838, sketching Sarah from many angles before creating a formal oil painting. Crawford put Sarah inside view, highlighting her muscle shape with lighting that showed the lines of her arms and shoulders. The painting was well done, but deeply dehumanizing. It showed Sarah as a specimen rather than a person, focusing entirely on body traits while wiping any hint of her inner life or real feelings. The finished portrait hung in Marcus Hargrove's study, where he brought visitors specifically to see it. He would stand before the painting and talk about his breeding program, using Sarah's image as proof that human beings could be systematically improved through careful choice of parents. The painting became famous in certain circles, discussed at gatherings of plantation owners, mentioned in private letters about farming ideas. Sarah saw the painting once when Reinhardt brought her to Marcus' study for some measurement discussion. The sight of her own image reduced to decoration in Marcus Hargrove's private space, displayed for his pride and other men's learning, created a moment of such deep shame and rage that Sarah had to leave the room quickly, fearing she would lose control and attack someone. That image, herself as object, as property, as proof of Marcus Hargrove's theories, became fixed in her mind as a symbol of everything she was being made into against her will. The years between 1838 and 1843 marked Sarah's final change from teen into adult, and the changes in her body went past even Marcus Hargrove's best hopes. By age 15, she had reached her full height of 6 feet 1 inch, making her taller than almost every man on the plantation, and certainly taller than any woman. Her body growth created a presence that was impossible to ignore. When Sarah entered a space, she owned it simply through size and strength. Her measurements during this time documented ordered muscle growth that Reinhardt described in his journals as unseen in female subjects, and amazing even compared to male workers chosen for strength. At 18, Sarah's chest measured 48 inches around, her arms 19 inches in circle, her shoulders spanning 23 inches, and her thighs measuring 28 inches around. These numbers appeared in countless journal entries, always with Reinhardt's notes about work ability, physical skills, and breeding hope. But numbers couldn't catch what it meant to live in Sarah's body, to possess strength that should have been helpful, but instead made her more totally trapped. She understood by now that her physical skills were the very reason she would never be free. She was too valuable to Marcus Hargrove. Money, wise, yes, but more importantly as proof of his life's work, proof that his theories were correct, evidence that his breeding program worked. Marcus' fixation with Sarah had grown as she had grown. He spoke about her constantly to visitors, wrote about her in letters to other plantation owners, and kept detailed plans about her future breeding use. He had already picked several male children in the program who would be good matches when they reached adulthood, planning Sarah's family life years in advance with the same cold math he used selecting horse fathers. Sarah was aware of these plans. News moved through the quarters in complex ways. House staff overheard talks in the main house and shared them. Field workers noticed which children received extra attention from Reinhardt. People pieced together the larger picture from bits of news. Sarah knew that Marcus intended to breed her, to use her body to produce the next generation of his experiment, and the knowledge sat inside her like poison, eating away any sense of hope or future that she might have tried to keep. During this time, Sarah was assigned to the rice mills, massive buildings where gathered rice was processed through steps that required constant heavy lifting. Workers carried 60-pound sacks of rice from storage areas to work spots, lifted the sacks onto tables for sorting, then carried processed rice to wagons for moving. The work was brutal for anyone. For Sarah, it became a daily show of the strength Marcus Hargrove had spent her entire life building. She worked alongside men, many of whom were chosen for field work specifically because of their size and strength. Sarah did better than most of them. She could carry heavier loads, work longer hours without rest, keep a pace that left others tired. The men she worked with had mixed reactions to this. Some respected her skills, others felt threatened or made small. Most understood that her strength was both impressive and sad, evidence of what the system could do to people when it treated them as breeding stock rather than human beings. The mills were places of constant danger. The machines, giant crushers powered by treadmills and water wheels, could crush hands or arms if workers weren't careful. The dust from rice shells filled the air, making breathing hard and causing lung problems for people who worked there for years. The heat was heavy with temperatures inside the mills often going over 100 degrees during summer months. Sarah worked in these conditions from age 15 through age 18. And Marcus Hargrove used her work as further proof of his program's success. He brought visitors to watch her working, pointing out how she handled loads that required 2 men to lift, how she kept pace throughout long days, how she showed no signs of the health where that affected other mill workers. These shows were exhibitions disguised as normal work, and Sarah understood that every moment of her labor was being judged, written down, turned into proof for Marcus' theories about human breeding. The visitors who came during this time included some of the South's richest and most powerful plantation owners. They came from South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and deeper South states like Alabama and Mississippi. They toured the plantation with Marcus, looked at his records, and always ended with watching Sarah working in the mills. Their reactions ranged from impressed to doubtful to worried, but most saw potential money uses if the breeding program's rules could be copied on their own plantations. One visitor during the summer of 1842 was very important. A Louisiana plantation owner named Charles Dupree, who ran a massive sugar farm near New Orleans. Dupree had heard about Marcus Hargrove's breeding program through letters with other plantation owners, and he had traveled to Georgia specifically to see Sarah and check whether the program's claims were real. He spent 4 days on the plantation, looked at Reinhardt's journals in detail, asked Marcus many questions about his methods, and watched Sarah working in the mills for long times. Dupree was impressed. He saw Sarah as proof that human beings could indeed be chosen and bred for wanted traits, and he believed that applying similar methods on his Louisiana plantation would yield big money benefits. Sugar farming was even more brutal than rice farming, needing huge body strength for cutting cane, hauling loads, and running processing machines. Workers who were stronger, tougher, and capable of long, heavy labor would be hugely valuable. On the evening of Dupree's final day, he made Marcus Hargrove an offer. He would buy Sarah for $5,000, an amazing amount that showed both her proven skills and her potential for breeding the next generation. Dupree explained his vision. He would pair Sarah with the strongest male workers on his Louisiana plantation, watch the resulting children, and potentially grow his own line of specially bred workers that would make his sugar farm the most productive in the region. Marcus' first reaction was no. Sarah represented 17 years of careful work, the peak of his father's theories and his own improvements. Selling her would mean leaving the program or starting over with younger subjects who would take decades to grow. But $5,000 was a huge sum, more money than Marcus had ever been offered for any enslaved person. The offer forced him to consider questions he had avoided. Was Sarah more valuable as a symbol of his success or as cash money that could be put into growing his business? He asked Dupree for time to think, and Dupree agreed, returning to Louisiana with the understanding that Marcus would send word within a month about whether he accepted the offer. Sarah learned of the potential sale through the household staff, enslaved people who worked in the main house, and overheard the deals between Marcus and Dupree. The news spread through the quarters in whispers, passed from person to person until everyone knew that Sarah might be sold away from Georgia, separated from her family and group, sent to Louisiana to become the start of another man's breeding program. The reaction in the quarters was mixed. Some saw the sale as a chance for Sarah. Louisiana was further from Marcus Hargrove's control, and perhaps she would find ways to escape or resist that weren't possible in Georgia. Others understood that the sale would simply move her to a different form of bondage with no guarantee of better conditions and the certainty of losing the only family she had ever known. For Sarah, the news was crushing. She had endured 17 years of planned abuse by holding on to connection with her mother, with Zena, with the group that had raised her. The thought of being torn away from these bonds, alone in Louisiana, with no one who knew her history or cared about her beyond her breeding use, created a panic she had never felt before. She spent a night in the quarters talking with her mother and Zena, trying to understand what choices existed. Dinina was in tears, holding Sarah and expressing helpless fury at a system that could tear families apart on a money whim. Zena was more practical, though no less sad. She explained that if the sale went through, Sarah would have to find new allies in Louisiana, would have to rebuild group ties, would have to survive and wait for chances to fight back. But Zena also said something that planted a seed in Sarah's mind. You're stronger than any of them. Stronger than the bosses, stronger than Marcus Hargrove, maybe stronger than several men combined. They've given you this strength, thinking it makes you worth more to them. But strength can be used for other things. Remember that. Those words, strength can be used for other things, echoed in Sarah's thoughts for days. She had spent her entire life being told that her strength existed to serve the Hargroves' interests, to make their plantation make more money, to prove their theories about human breeding. But what if her strength could serve different goals? What if the very skills they had built into her could be turned against the system that had created them? She began thinking differently about her situation. She began watching the plantation's work with new attention, noticing weak spots, understanding how dependent the entire system was on enslaved people's help. She began having quiet talks with people she trusted, testing ideas, checking whether others would support action if chances came. The late summer of 1842 brought news that complicated everything. Marcus Hargrove had agreed to sell Sarah to Charles Dupree. The sale would be finished after the rice harvest ended in October, giving Marcus time to ensure maximum profit from the growing season before losing Sarah's labor. The price was $50,000, and the terms said that Sarah would be moved to Louisiana immediately after payment with no delay that might allow her to escape or create problems. Sarah had about 2 months to decide what she would do. The time between learning of the sale and its planned date became a hard test for Sarah, a time when every decision carried weight that would determine not just her future, but potentially the futures of others in the quarters. She couldn't sleep more than a few hours each night, her mind constantly working through possibilities, checking options, trying to find some path forward that didn't end in death or worse conditions than she already lived with. The first decision she made was to start training others. She had spent 17 years building strength through work and through the extra food Marcus Hargrove provided. She understood how to grow body skills, and she began sharing this knowledge in the early morning hours before work started. She would gather small groups, never more than 4 or 5 people at a time to avoid suspicion, and teach them exercises that built strength, ways to lift heavy loads easily, ways to increase staying power. She presented this training as practical, as methods for making the brutal work slightly more bearable by being physically stronger. But her real purpose was to create a group of people who would be capable of physical fight if chances came. She was preparing for possibilities she couldn't fully say yet, building power for action while understanding that the moment to act might never come. The people she trained responded with different levels of energy. Some understood immediately what Sarah was really doing and committed themselves fully to the training. Others joined, but remained doubtful that anything could actually be done against a system backed by overwhelming force and laws. A few refused entirely, too frightened of results or too broken by years of bondage to imagine that fighting back was possible. Among those who committed fully was a man named Isaac, 32 years old, who had been born on the plantation and worked as a field hand. Isaac had watched Sarah's growth over the years with a mix of awe and sorrow, understanding that she was both amazing and trapped. He had lost his own wife and children when Marcus Hargrove sold them to an Alabama plantation in 1839 to settle a debt. And the loss had left him with nothing to lose, making him willing to take risks that others avoided. Isaac became Sarah's closest friend during this period. He helped bring others for the training sessions, provided smart thinking about how resistance might work if it came to that, and offered emotional support to Sarah as she handled the mental weight of planning something that could get everyone killed. Another key figure was a woman named Esther, 28 years old, who worked in the main house as a cook. Esther's job gave her access to news that field workers never heard. She overheard talks between Marcus and Elizabeth Hargrove, listened to discussions with visitors, and noticed papers left visible in Marcus' study. She passed this news to Sarah whenever possible, creating a spy network that helped Sarah understand exactly what was being planned and what weak spots might exist. Through Esther, Sarah learned details about the sale that weren't common knowledge. Charles Dupree had paid half the price upfront, with the remaining $500 to be paid upon Sarah's delivery to Louisiana. Marcus had hired professional slave catchers to transport Sarah, men known for cruel efficiency in stopping escape attempts during transfers. The transport was set for October 28, 1843, right after the final rice harvest. Sarah also learned something that changed her entire understanding of Marcus Hargrove's breeding program. Through Esther's watching, Sarah discovered that Marcus kept extra records in his study, papers that went beyond the measurements and checks in Reinhardt's journals. These records detailed the full reach of the breeding program over 3 generations, included information about enslaved people who had been sold or who died as part of the experiments, and contained Marcus' future plans for growing the program across many plantations. Sarah knew she needed to see those records, needed to understand the full reach of what had been done, but getting into Marcus' study was extraordinarily dangerous. The main house was off-limits to field workers, and any enslaved person found there without good reason would face hard punishment. Still, the knowledge that those records existed, that they proved everything Marcus had done, created a fixation in Sarah that matched Marcus' own fixation with breeding. She began planning how to get into the study, and this planning required resources and friends she had been carefully gathering. She needed someone to create a distraction that would draw house staff and bosses away from the main house. She needed someone who could pick the lock on Marcus' study door, a skill that existed among the enslaved group because people learned whatever skills helped them survive. She needed people who would watch for anyone coming while Sarah was inside the study. By mid-September, Sarah had put together a team of 8 people willing to help. Isaac and 3 other field workers, Esther and 2 other house staff members, and an old man named Solomon, who had once been a blacksmith and possessed skills with locks and metalwork that made him valuable despite his age. They chose September 22nd for the try, a date when Marcus and Elizabeth Hargrove were set to attend a party at a nearby plantation, leaving the main house with less watching. The plan was simple in idea, but scary in action. Solomon would pick the lock on the study door. Sarah would enter and look at the records, copying or taking papers that seemed most important, while the others kept watch and created minor problems elsewhere on the plantation that would keep bosses busy. The day arrived with typical coastal weather, hot and wet with afternoon storms rolling in from the Atlantic. The weather actually helped. Rain and wind would keep people indoors or busy securing tools and supplies. Marcus and Elizabeth left for their party in the early afternoon, traveling by carriage with 2 house staff members. Sarah waited until evening when the main house stood mostly dark and quiet. She moved through the grounds with surprising quiet for someone her size, reaching the back door where Solomon waited with his lock tools and nervous energy. Isaac and the others were placed at key spots, ready to make distractions if anyone came. Solomon worked the lock for nearly 10 minutes, his hands shaking from age and fear, before the lock clicked open. Sarah entered Marcus Hargrove's study, closing the door behind her and lighting a small candle that gave just enough light to see. The study was exactly as she had seen it once years earlier, filled by a large desk covered with papers and books, walls lined with shelves, and the painting of Sarah hanging clearly where Marcus could see it from his desk. The sight of her own image, reduced to decoration and proof of Marcus' theories, sent fury through her that she had to force down. She found the books in a locked desk drawer, but Solomon's tools worked on this simpler lock. Inside were 3 leather-bound books, each filled with Marcus Hargrove's careful handwriting, noting decades of planned human breeding. Sarah read by candlelight, her hands shaking as she took in news that was worse than she thought. The first book dated to her grandfather Alexander Hargrove's time, noting his first tests in the 1810s. Sarah learned about forced pairings, about children checked and found wanting, about people sold away when they didn't grow according to plans. She learned about pregnancies that ended in loss or stillbirth because women were worked too hard. She learned about medical tests Alexander had done, testing his ideas about family traits by purposely putting pregnant women in different conditions and recording outcomes. The second book covered Marcus Hargrove's early years running the farm from 1825 through 1835. Here Sarah found mentions of her own mother's earlier pregnancies, 3 children before Sarah, all checked by Marcus and his father during Alexander's final years. The children had been sold to different plantations when they failed to show the wanted body traits. Families purposefully split to make room for the next set of tests. Sarah found names. Her half-siblings Thomas sold to a tobacco farm in Virginia in 1822. Rachel sold to a cotton operation in Alabama in 1823. Benjamin sold to a rice plantation in South Carolina in 1825. She had family she had never known existed, scattered across hundreds of miles. Their locations listed in Marcus' careful records alongside notes about why they had been deemed bad for the breeding program. The third book was the most disturbing. It covered 1835 through the present and included detailed plans for the future. Marcus had written down Sarah's entire growth, every size check, every show for visitors, every plan for her future use. But he had also planned beyond Sarah, planning how her children would be put back into the breeding program, creating a growing network across many plantations in different states. Sarah discovered that Marcus had already dealt with Charles Dupree about buying back any children Sarah produced in Louisiana, bringing them to Georgia to continue the line. He had made similar deals with 2 other plantation owners in South Carolina and Mississippi, creating a system where children from the breeding program would be moved across many properties, then carefully brought together for future breeding as adults. The scale was huge and scary. Marcus intended to create a network of plantations taking part in joint breeding programs, sharing news and trading selected people to get the best traits. He imagined this system growing across the entire South, turning slavery from merely a money system into a full program of human breeding that would span generations and places. Sarah found all of this written in Marcus' neat handwriting, complete with money guesses about increased work and value. He had calculated that enslaved people bred for specific traits could be sold for double or triple normal prices, creating massive profits that would push other plantation owners to join the network. The rage that filled Sarah in that moment was clearing. She had known the breeding program was cruel, had lived with that cruelty every day of her life. But discovering the full reach, the casual breaking of families, the cold math behind every forced pregnancy, the vision of growing this system across the entire South, changed her understanding of what was at risk. She took specific pages from the books, papers that detailed the breeding program's history and Marcus' future plans. She wanted proof, wanted papers that could prove what had been done, even if she didn't survive to tell the story herself. She carefully removed pages while trying to make the damage less obvious, then put the books back in the drawer and prepared to leave. But as she blew out her candle and prepared to leave the study, she heard voices outside. Marcus and Elizabeth, returning earlier than expected from their party. Sarah had seconds to make a decision. Try to leave through the door and risk being seen, or hide inside the study and hope she wouldn't be found. She chose to hide, squeezing herself behind a tall bookshelf in the corner where shadows were deepest. She heard Marcus and Elizabeth enter the main house, heard their voices as they moved through rooms below, and she waited in darkness with her heart pounding so loud she feared it would give her away. Sarah remained hidden behind the bookshelf for nearly 3 hours, barely breathing, listening to sounds from elsewhere in the house. Marcus and Elizabeth had gone to their bedroom on the second floor, but house staff moved through the building, and Sarah could hear footsteps, voices, doors opening and closing. She couldn't leave without being discovered, and discovery would mean immediate punishment and likely torture to tell if she had taken anything or if others were involved. The papers she had taken were folded inside her clothes, pressed against her body. If she was found and searched, those papers would be found, and everyone who had helped her would face pain. The risk grew with every passing minute, but Sarah had no safe way to leave until the household settled completely for the night. Finally, past midnight, the main house became truly quiet. Sarah waited another 30 minutes to be certain, then carefully came out from behind the bookshelf. Her legs were cramped from hours of staying still, and she moved slowly to get blood moving before going to the study door. She opened it carefully, checking the hall beyond. Empty, she moved through the main house like a ghost, using skills she had learned during years of being watched. She knew how to move quietly despite her size, knew which floorboards squeaked, knew how to control her breath to remain silent. She reached the back door without trouble, slipped outside into coastal wet air, thick enough to feel like water, and made her way back to the quarters. Isaac was waiting, had remained awake all night, watching for her return, and his relief at seeing her was clear even in darkness. "You were there so long," he whispered. "We thought you had been caught." "They came home early," Sarah replied, her voice tight with leftover fear. "I had to hide, but I got what we needed. Isaac, it's worse than we thought, much worse." Over the next 3 days, Sarah shared what she had found with the group she had been training. She showed them the papers she had taken, explained the size of Marcus Hargrove's breeding program, and his vision for growing it across the South. The reaction was a mixture of horror, rage, and for some, a kind of grim truth. They had known the system was evil, but having written proof of planned human breeding, of families purposefully destroyed across decades, of future plans to grow the program, made the evil undeniable and real. But knowing the truth created a problem. What could they do with this news? They were enslaved people with no legal rights, no way to reach courts or bosses who would listen to them, no way to expose Marcus Hargrove's program through official paths. The only people they could maybe reach were other plantation owners who likely shared Marcus' views or Northern freedom fighters who were too far away to give instant help. Sarah argued that they had to do more than just have knowledge. They had to act in ways that would break the system, at least stopping the sale to Louisiana, ideally creating enough chaos to escape entirely. But escape where? Georgia was surrounded by slave states, and reaching free northern states meant traveling hundreds of miles through dangerous land where slave catchers worked, and any black person without papers would be assumed to be a runaway. The debate among the group lasted 2 days with people arguing different sides. Some wanted to try escape right away. Others thought escape was impossible and preferred breaking the plantation to hurt Marcus financially. A few were so frightened of results that they wanted to drop the entire plan. Sarah let everyone speak. Then she made her stance clear. She would not be sold to Louisiana. She would rather die fighting than be moved to become the start of Charles Dupree's breeding program. If others wanted to join her in fighting, she would welcome their help. But she understood the risks were huge and didn't judge anyone who chose staying alive over fighting. Her willingness to die fighting changed the mood. Several people who had been unsure promised themselves, driven by Sarah's strength or shamed by their own fear, and the group solidified around a core of 13 people willing to take joint action. The plan they made over the next several days had many parts and was meant to create big trouble. They would break plantation tools in ways that looked accidental, start small fires in fields far from the quarters, damage the rice mill machines to stop work, and create an air of growing disaster that would distract bosses and create chances for escape during the chaos. The timing was key. They would begin the damage 1 week before Sarah's scheduled leaving, giving them time to create growing chaos while Sarah remained on the plantation. If successful, they would try escape during the confusion, with Sarah's strength allowing her to overcome blocks that would stop others. But Sarah had another goal beyond escape. She wanted Marcus Hargrove to understand that he had created something he couldn't control, that the breeding program hadn't just produced body strength, but had grown rage and smarts and the power for joint fighting. The damage began on October 15th, 8 days before Sarah's planned trip. The first events were small. A key gear in the rice mill got a tiny crack that grew under stress until the machine stopped. Tools broke at key moments, a plow handle snapping, an axe head flying off, a wagon wheel breaking, each event causing delays and needing repairs that used time and goods. Small fires appeared in fields where no one had been working, suggesting either extreme sloppiness or purposeful action. The fires were always found before they spread badly, but they created constant alerts, pulled bosses away from other jobs, and made an air of crisis that made normal plantation work harder and harder. Reinhardt noticed the pattern, but couldn't prove planned damage. Everything could be explained as bad luck or the result of old tools and tired workers making mistakes. But the number of events was unusual enough to make him suspicious, and he increased watching of the quarters, looking for signs of organized fight. Marcus Hargrove grew more and more upset as problems piled up. The rice harvest was late, costing him money and potentially affecting his name among other plantation owners. Visitors who had planned to watch the final stages of harvest pushed back their trips, unwilling to see what appeared to be a plantation going downhill. Charles Dupree sent a letter asking whether the sale should go on, stating worry that if conditions at the plantation were getting worse, Sarah's value might be hurt. The pressure grew Marcus' response. He increased work hours, cut already small food amounts, and allowed bosses to use harder punishment for any seen wrongdoing. He meant this harder discipline to bring back order, but it had the opposite effect. People who had been unsure to join Sarah's resistance saw no other choice, and the support for joint action grew. On October 21st, 2 days before Sarah's planned leaving, the situation got much worse. The rice mill suffered huge structural failure when a support beam, previously weakened through careful damage, fell during use. The beam fell across machines, destroying parts that would take weeks to fix. And while no one was killed, several workers suffered injuries serious enough to stop them from working. That same day, fire broke out in the main barn, destroying tools and supplies worth thousands of dollars. The fire appeared to start from a lantern left too close to hay, a believable accident, but its timing, combined with other events, made Reinhardt and Marcus suspicious that something more planned was happening. The evening of October 21st, Marcus Hargrove called an emergency meeting with his bosses. Sarah learned about this meeting through Esther, who overheard the talks while serving dinner. Marcus was convinced that purposeful damage was happening, and he was starting new security rules, more patrols of the quarters at night, limits on moving between different areas of the plantation, and more watching of anyone linked to the recent events. These new security rules threatened the planned escape. Sarah gathered her group that night for an emergency meeting in the dark between the quarters and the trees. They argued whether to drop the plan or speed it up, whether to wait for better chances or accept that the current moment might be their only chance. Isaac argued for instant action. "We've upset them enough that they're messy, but if we wait, they'll fix security and we'll have no chance. We have to move now, tonight, before their new rules take full effect." Others disagreed, arguing that acting right away meant leaving careful planning for desperate guessing that would likely fail. The debate became hot, with people's fear and anger coming out in raised voices that threatened to draw attention. Sarah let them argue for several minutes, then she made a decision. "We act tomorrow night, October 22nd. That gives us 1 day to finish details while their security is still being set up. It's our best mix between getting ready and opportunity. Everyone who wants to come, be ready. Everyone who wants to stay, I understand, and there's no judgment." When the meeting ended, 13 people had promised to attempt escape. 23 others said they would join in creating distractions, but wouldn't run because they had families or were too frightened of results. Sarah thanked everyone for their bravery, understanding that even those who chose not to run were taking huge risks by supporting the disruption. The following day, October 22nd, Sarah finished her assigned work in the rice mills with unusual focus, aware that this might be her last day on the Hargrove plantation. She memorized details of the land, noted the spots of bosses, watched patterns in patrol schedules. She was getting ready for the night ahead with the same careful attention Marcus Hargrove had applied to measuring her growth, except now that attention served her goals rather than his. As evening came, coastal weather turned wild. Thunderstorms rolled in from the Atlantic, bringing wind that bent trees and rain that fell in sheets. The weather was both a gift and a danger. It would provide cover for escape, but also make travel harder and more dangerous. Sarah watched the storm grow and decided it was worth the risk. The chaos of the weather would help hide their leaving. Night fell with lightning lighting up the plantation in brief, stark flashes. Sarah waited until after midnight, when most people had gone to sleep despite the storm. Then she moved through the quarters, touching doors in a set signal. 13 people came out, all Dr.